Welcome to the Surfcast Podcast, your weekly source for surf fishing discussions, tactics, interviews, news, and more. The Surfcast Podcast is hosted by Jerry Audette and Toby Lipinski, two of the most dedicated and obsessed surf fishermen that you will ever meet. The tide is up, the wind is at our back, so let's hit the surf.
This is the Surfcast Podcast. I am Jerry Audette.
And I am Toby Lipinski. And, this time of year, I often think about surf fishing and traveling to surf fish, or just fishing in general when I travel. It's on my mind. And, I've traveled a lot over the years for my job. When I worked with the Fisherman magazine, currently with Fishing Tackle Retailer, I just get to go different, venues, experiences around the country. I go to Florida. I've gone to South Carolina. I'll be going to California next year. But despite all the traveling, I really rarely get to fish because it's always business. I'm always in town for ICAST or the ASA Summit or some sort of event with a manufacturer. And unless that event itself is letting you fish and providing everything, I don't have the time realistically. And there was one trip I was down in, it was at Fort Lauderdale. I check into my hotel room, hotel's on the water. I take a look outside, call up my wife, and as I'm looking into the marina, I see a gigantic snook just finning along, doing its thing, where I ran downstairs and I'm out on the dock watching this thing and it spooked off. And I'm like, if I just had brought some gear with me. Then later that afternoon, we go out on a boat and there's these gigantic tarpon sitting underneath the docks. I grab my GoPro, I drop it under. For me, gigantic. They're probably 100-pound class tarpon, arm's length away, just watching. And again, it's killing me. I don't get the opportunities to fish when I travel, except for once I finally made it happen. A couple years ago, went down to Naples for the ASA Summit. I brought a rod, brought a bunch of gear. I caught some snook, some ladyfish, some oddball croaker stuff. I don't even know what I was catching. I hooked into a couple of tarpon. I remember sending you text, dude, I just hooked a tarpon and got smoked. And it was so cool to finally actually be able to do it. But I don't know what the heck I'm doing. I packed wrong stuff, the wrong lures, some stuff that was good, way too much stuff. By, no extent was there too much. I almost had my Van Staal pliers confiscated in the airport because they were too large. And I had in my carry-on stuff. So further proof that I don't really know what I'm doing.
That's funny. So
it really got me thinking, especially considering you go to Florida every year for a nice little trip. What have you learned over the years? Because you've done a lot of different trips. Even when we were talking the other day, more than just your annual Florida trips, you've done the Carolinas, the Outer Banks.
Yep, done the Outer Banks a lot. Done California 5-6 times.
You've got the experience of doing the travel, so it really got me thinking, what are some of the things you've learned that make sense, how you prep for it, what you should and shouldn't bring, those kind of things. For someone that perhaps like me, that gets to travel a bit for work, or maybe is on a little family vacation and wants to sneak in, even if it's just one little outing, so that you're bringing the stuff that makes the most sense. I want to learn about it, so I'm hoping some of the listeners and viewers out there want to as well.
Yeah, sure. So, before I even go into this, I do want to say, while I have done a fair amount of travel, and my travel has really skyrocketed since the pandemic, actually, or maybe right before, I am not world-class traveler. I know a lot of guys, fishing-wise, who they got to Mongolia and South Africa and Australia, and they're doing 2 or 3 of these trips a year, and they're traveling all over the country. My travel trips have been spread out now for, oh gosh, I guess I should have prepped this. I don't know, probably 20 years, where I've been traveling around to fish in the surf. But that being said, I'm still not the greatest expert in the whole world. So, we had talked about this, Toby. We will try to be very honest on the Surfcast Podcast. We will not try. We will be. And we'll talk about when we know something, when we have expertise in it, when it feels like something that's a truth versus something that's more of an opinion, or, we're more loosely thinking about that kind of thing. It's an experiment. I would say I have some good expertise, but I don't want to represent myself as like, you know, the most refined traveler in the world.
You got me beat though, so we'll go with
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Well, I mean, that being said, I mean, in the last couple of years, I made 3 Florida trips that have accounted, multiple weeks for each one. And, I've been going to down East Maine a lot, which is a little bit different, but that's a lot of work as well. And I've spent more than 100 nights in the Outer Banks. I've done the Keys a lot before. I've been on a 15-day trip prior, years ago. I've done a lot of trips to California for work when I was a scientist. And I always packed a rod for those, which is tricky sometimes when, you get in for the dinner, you do the dinner quick, and then you're like, I gotta go. And then you're like I'm like running down to the ocean and, in San Diego and trying to like fish off a pier or something. So we'll talk about that.
Well, that's actually perfect because San Diego is where I'm going next October. So off the podcast, I'm gonna be hitting you up for a little intel on that one.
So yeah, and I'll tell everyone else the number one thing to do if you go to San Diego is go over to Marco Island and there's a water ferry that goes behind the convention, takes you over the island. You can walk the whole island if you want. It's not very far. That's what I've done every time. I just take it over, walk the distance. It might actually be like 3 miles though, so I can't remember. And then I took an Uber back. And there's surf perch all over the surf there. And I hooked a couple of things that seemed like they were pretty large. By pretty large, I'm using a 6-piece Shakespeare rod that cost like $15 on Amazon. Because that's what I was using at the time. And I had stuff that was too big for the surf perch. And that was kind of a disaster. But, I've caught a lot of cool fish that are, I don't know what they are. They're like snapper, grouper sort of family of stuff. And we'll get to that in a second. So that's what I'm going to say. My number one tip, I think, is if you're going to be traveling for work, if you're going with the family or otherwise, I think one of the most important things is to focus. I think a lot of anglers will say, I just want to catch anything. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to throw something out into the surf, whether it's bait or it's a lure or whatever. Whatever I'm going to catch, I'm going to catch. And I have found in my opinion and in my experience, you have a lower rate of success with that. It's better to say prior to the trip, doing a little bit of prep time, and you don't need to do tons, but the more you do is the better. And that's another huge tip. Like get on the internet, do research, troll the forums, check out YouTube, etc. There's a lot of crap out there. Keep your BS meter very high. Filter out a lot of it. But, do your research. But then pick a species. So if you're going to Florida, decide if you're going to try to catch a snook or a tarpon or a bonefish or, sheep's head, or you're going to try to catch a largemouth bass, or you're going to get a peacock. Don't go to the Everglades and say, I'm going to try and catch one of the 5,000 species that's in there and I'm just going to throw something out. It can work. And, it worked for you even. You just said it can definitely work. And I've done that. But I've been much more successful being like, when I go to the Keys this trip, I'm going to catch a bonefish. I'm not going to fish at night. I'm going to carry things for bonefish and I'm going to focus on bonefish. The last few years I've been saying, I'm going to focus on tarpon. I'm going to the Keys. I'm going to other places. I'm sleeping all day. I'm using no sunscreen and I'm staying up all night and fishing for tarpon. Now, of course, if you're a family guy, family woman, and you can't do that, then you can only do what you can do. I would say focus. Focus, focus, focus. Traveling for stripers is a 5-6 hour talk that I could give. Mm-hmm. But I think that's even true of stripers. I think a lot of guys go with a mission that I'm just going to fish as much as I can, and I'm just going to fish everywhere I can, and I'm just going to see what happens. And I think it's better to focus on like, I'm going to fish the night tides, I'm going to fish the boulder field, I'm going to fish the outflow, whatever it is. But that's a whole nother talk. I don't even know if might be too big even for a podcast or multiple podcasts, but we'll see. So that's tip number one. I think that's the big tip for me.
Now, as far as like figuring out, dialing down that species, for instance, when I went to Naples, I looked like Chamber of Commerce fishing in Naples, like anything I could to get an idea of what was available seasonally, etc. Is that kind of like how you would go about it too? If it's a brand new place for you, for instance, you were going.
Yeah, to keep this, totally honest, what I do is a little bit unfair if you're a family guy or you're going on a business trip, because now that I'm traveling for work and I'm like there to fish, it's a little bit different. But the way I focus on it is exactly what you said. If I'm going during a certain time of year, I'm doing that because I've chose a specific species. Now, of course, a lot of things overlap. If you're listening to this and you're from Georgia and you come to New England in September, you can target fluke, albies, sharks, stripers, bluefish. You can do a bunch of stuff. The same thing if you go to Florida in May or April or November, right? But for me, I try to just see what's available during the time of year. Huge disclaimer. If you're going to go to Florida, a lot of that stuff is there a lot of the time. And I've found that, and again, don't want to be, misrepresenting myself, but I have found that a lot of the guides are really not so great. And that people's assumptions are really bad too. And that, I think striper guys probably know that because we see stuff written about stripers that we know is not true. We see stuff about, oh my God, especially about the canal. I mean, people have all these assumptions about it that are just not even correct, right? So, but that's how I sort of decide on what I'm going to do. Now, the next tip I have is really along those same lines, Toby. What are you good at? What are you good at? Are you good at night fishing? Are you good at sight fishing? Are you good at throwing pencil poppers? Are you good at bucktail and current? Take that and travel with it. So if you're a inlet bucktailer and you're really good at that, I think it would be smart for you to go and fish in an outflow, in under a bridge, in a big inlet somewhere, in a river somewhere, in a hard tidal rip, something like that. Go do what you're good at. What am I good at? I'm good at fishing at night with lures and flies. So tarpon, for me, are a very natural fish to target. I have made the mistake, although I've been successful too, I've made the mistake of saying, I'm going to catch bonefish. Spend 100 hours staring at the water to see one, spook it, see another one, cast at it, and have it swim right by, turn to look at my fly, and then just keep going. Okay, if you're okay with that, that's fine. But then, those first few trips, I'm like, well, I'm not even focused on this, and I'm fishing at night for these tarpon, and I'm having this great success. Guys pay $1,000 for a guide, and I'm exceeding that because that's my skill set. I'm good at that. So I think that that's another mistake. Don't get caught up on what the locals are doing. Pay attention to it. Make sure you understand it. But what are you good at? Are you good at something? Do you think that this is your wheelhouse? Then do that. That's what I think is such an easy thing to do, especially if you have limited time. That's one of my top tips for sure.
No, that certainly makes sense. And it's funny as you say it, I'm thinking through what I did on that, my limited experience, that Naples trip where I found success. I looked at satellite imagery of where the hotel was. I looked what was around. I found that there was this back marsh area, whatever they call it down there, and an outflow dumped out to a beach. So I targeted the mouth of that outflow and the surrounding beach, and I approached it the same way I would if I was working a little outflow tidal creek here in New England. And I mean, I found success right away, partially because of luck, partially because I didn't realize it until you just said it, but I used really what I already knew, my skill set, and I just picked it up here and I put it there and it produced.
Toby, people aren't going to believe this, but we really didn't practice this. But you're absolutely right, and you've just brought up another absolutely critical component to my traveling. And that's that predators are predators, and of course bonefish and permit are weird. If you're trying to catch something bizarre, there's halibut. I mean, there's obviously, but actually that's probably not a great example, but there's all kinds of weird species. But one of my top tips for traveling is find some water that's moving from somewhere to somewhere and fish it. Find a conveyor belt. Find a backwater that's moving into the ocean. Find a backwater that's moving from a smaller backwater. Find a canal. Find an inlet. Find a breachway. Find a whatever. Find a bridge. Find a conveyor belt, because predators are predators. And that gets so lost. I mean, even let's take bonefish again. Even bonefish. Bonefish love that current moving off the flat and dumping to an edge. And my first few bonefish I've caught, and I've only caught a few, so again, I don't want to misrepresent. I am an absolute novice. I mean, absolutely novice when it comes to it. And yes, I've caught 4 or 5 by myself without a guide. I don't hire guides. But again, I'm total novice. But I caught them in places where there was moving water. In fact, I almost got eaten by a bull shark. That's a whole other story because there's friggin' serious moving water there. And there was a deep section with grass that transitioned like a hard demarcation, like a line, to shallower, harder bottom. And the current there was really moving, and that's how I just blind cast. Just blind cast until I felt this little puff, set the hook, and all of a sudden I got this massive 25 plus inch bonefish, which I guess is like, I don't know, the record is like 27 inches. So I had no idea what I had at the time. I mean, not even close to knowing, and then I caught little like one-handers after that, but
yeah,
it was crazy.
Anything on the bonefish, I'd be psyched, because that's when I don't even think I've seen one in the waters when I've been around. So
remarkable fish, and maybe we'll get somebody on to talk about that at some point. But
yeah,
so moving water somewhere to somewhere. You can, and I've done this too. I've spent so many hours on the Outer Banks, but don't go fishing open sandy beach unless you just want to walk the beach at sunrise and cast because it's fun, it's relaxing, and you're on vacation. Fine. And that gets down to another thing I was going to say anyways, which is have reasonable expectations, right? And it seems obvious, but boy, some guys are like, oh, I don't know why I can't. I go every year and I don't know why I can't catch anything. But then they send 6 hours total fishing every year. You do that for 30 years, you only spend 180 hours. I mean, that's like, what? That's like a month in the surf, a couple months. Well, I mean, it's more than that, but it's a few months in the surf at one season. So you got to keep your expectations, but don't walk a sand beach. Don't try to tackle a crystal clear flat. Don't try to sight fish with your fly rod. Find some current, throw a lure in there, throw some bait in there. That has been so crucial for my success when I travel. I mean, freshwater too, frankly, even. Mm-hmm. So for sure, that's another really important tip for me, I think. For sure. So the other thing along those same lines, along the current, do what you know, don't worry about the lure so much. I mean, again, let's use the bonefish. Yes, get little flies and you got to be really careful and you got to use long, light tippets and all of that stuff. But also you could use a clouser. And what striper guy who fly fishes doesn't have a clouser? Mm-hmm. For tarpon, you're fishing a big inlet, maybe a point with a lot of current, maybe under a bridge. You could use a bucktail. You don't need a no live bait needed, which is a fine lure, and I'm not, they're great, and they've had great success down there. That company has been doing very well. But you can just use a bucktail. Mm-hmm. You can use, the thing I use for tarpon the most is a sluggo. I'm a sluggo fiend. I'm a zealot of the sluggo. I bow down at the altar of the sluggo, and that's what I know how to use. So that's what I take there. A Z-Man Hero Z or a Super Fluke or something. That's all stuff that we know how to use. Use that. Mm-hmm. Use a darter. Nobody in Florida uses a darter. Well, Crazy Alberto does, but he's about the only person that does, and a few other guys,
Yeah, Al definitely started that. But it's funny you saying that too. Like when I packed that, I'll keep going back to it in this discussion, that Naples trip. I had to up to a bigger suitcase than I would normally, more than just my carry-on because I had so much junk. And I started with some shad bodies, some tsunami glass minnows, a couple of small spooks, a couple like mag darter type plastic swimmers. I started with like the base stuff that I knew, and then I brought a whole bunch of shrimp looking stuff and all these things that everybody was saying you had to use. And granted, I caught one snook on one little shrimp thing, but it was like off of a pier in some back area that I hadn't planned on fishing. I found the success on, again, using the stuff I knew how to present, because I went to a scenario I knew how to fish, and I put a lure in it that I knew how to present in that scenario. So that certainly helped. Where even there, I remember seeing guys trying to fish bait on the bottom that they had just cast net on one side of the beach in the middle of this ripping outflow. And I'm just thinking to myself, that isn't gonna work. And it didn't. And I got a couple fish on artificials. Next to them with bait because it wasn't the right thing in that situation. So that's another really good, excellent point.
Yeah, and I'm going to give credit to Al Albano, one of the Surfcasters Journal columnists. I did an interview with him, and he really hammered this point. And I had already been ascribing to it, but he really implanted it in my mind, and he said that guys who are in certain regions get stuck on certain things, and for some reason, a lot of people in certain regions, I won't say where, they get stuck on certain things and don't get caught up on that. Learn how to fish for predators. Learn how water movement impacts predators. Understand the biology of the fish you're fishing for. Does it have a forward-facing mouth, a downward-facing mouth? Does it chase stuff? Does it ambush? And then go from there. Because exactly what you're talking about, I see people doing stuff wrong. What I assume is wrong, and my results speak for themselves. And I will say this. I don't want to be derogatory towards any place, but my experience been in Florida. I don't know what a lot of the guys are doing that I've seen down fishing there side by side with them. And I'm like, what are you doing? And I know that they have success, but it seems like for the amount of time that I've put in, I've had some pretty good success, potentially better success than these guys are doing it all the time. And I think that's because I'm not stuck on go here, cast this, catch fish. It's what does it do? How does it act? What do I have that fits in that? What key is going to unlock that lock, open that door? So for me, again, now moving a little bit to a different tip, soft plastics are so easy to travel with, and they work everywhere. And if you're in a bind and you need to replace a jig head, you can get a jig head anywhere. If you want to take Super Strike darters to Florida or California, you're going to have a hard time replacing it if you lose them. You want to take the big Dock Spook, you're not going to find that. It's not going to be over there, right? So for me, soft plastics are great because I can bring some with me in a gallon plastic bag. I can bring a variety of sizes. Again, worship at the altar of the Sluggo. And I can bring jig heads. Jig heads are heavy. That's the only thing. Mm-hmm. But if you bring sort of a bare essentials, which for me is probably 6 of each size, but I go for a long period of time, right? I'm going for a long period of time. So I'm going to bring 3/8, halves, and 3/4. I'm going to make sure I have 6 of my primaries. If I start losing them, I'll go looking for something that's similar. I will say I haven't had great luck with that ever, and no matter where I go, because it seems like whatever's regionally hot, they have, and a lot of times I don't care about that because I don't know what it is. I don't know how to use it. I'm more comfortable with what I'm doing, and quite frankly, I'm potentially having a different plan of action. So soft plastics, highly recommended. The other one is some kind of topwater popper. If that's all you brought, topwater popper and soft plastics, and you're even like, Jerry, I don't have time to learn about a tarpon or a snook or a milkfish or a bonefish or a sailfish. Yeah, fine. Then bring some soft plastics. I don't like paddle tails. Use a paddle tail. Get a paddle tail. Fine. Bring a topwater popper. A pencil popper, a Polaris popper, a regular, just like a normal, tubular popper, whatever.
Yeah.
Bring a popper and go to town. That's what I'd say.
Now, I referenced that trip to Naples. I had packed a lot of stuff. I had a primary suitcase, but I also had a carry-on. And when they were going through my carry-on and they found my Van Staal pliers, which are 7.5 inches long, it became this big thing because you're not allowed to carry pliers over 7 inches on a carry-on, which I should have known ahead of time. And fortunately, one of the people at security knew what they were and took pity on me. They wasn't going to confiscate them on me because the other person wanted to.
Thank God. Yeah.
Is there any little things like that you're like, don't bother with this, leave this at home, don't try either in carry-on or even just going to take up space in your primary suitcase? Is there something that you've found that's maybe not obvious originally until you really thought about it?
Yeah, so some gear tips in terms of traveling. So not to make this too long. So first off, I can't recommend Southwest enough because you get 2 free bags. So if you fly Southwest, you get a backpack, a check bag, a carry-on, and 2 check bags that weigh 50 pounds each. One of my bags is just fishing stuff. That's all I bring. One of the bags I check is just fishing stuff, and it'll be 49.5 pounds. Like I will fill it to the max. Put fly rods in there, put rods in there, put, whatever you need, get a hard case thing, whatever. Great. I recommend whenever I travel to bring a good flashlight. In the striper surf, it drives me crazy, but if you're coming to the striper surf, you're going to listen to this and go, well, I'm going to do it. But I bring a bright flashlight because a lot of times I'm doing some investigation. Now, I know, Toby, you carry a bright flashlight and most nights you don't use it unless you're looking for bait or something like that. Great. Don't put the lithium batteries in your check bags. They will take them. Learn that. It doesn't make any sense, but put them in your carry-on. That's what you're going to do with those. So if you got those big batteries, you got lithiums, they got to go in your carry-on. Don't put them in your check. So that's one big key for me. In terms of other stuff, I have put massive lures in my carry-ons and, big, all this stuff. I haven't tried to put pliers. They've always gone in just because they're heavy, so I haven't had to run into that. I've put a knife in my check, no problem. That was no problem. So, it wasn't a huge knife. It was just, a little guy, but,
You're not
no
packing
problem.
the Bowie knife?
What's that?
Not packing the Bowie knife or the machete?
Yeah. No, it's not. This is a knife. That's a knife. This is a knife.
Yes.
No, none of that stuff. No Crocodile Dundee blades. So that's really the only thing I've run into. I get pulled aside because of my camera equipment. I just got pulled aside again on this last trip where they take me aside and run strips of stuff looking for whatever explosives all over my stuff. And, it's sitting there and I got my extra clothes and my extra underwear laying all over the stuff. And this, beautiful woman is going over my camera equipment. It's laying. Anyways.
They have to when they go through your luggage, the underwear, they know they have to put those out. It's part of the process.
Yeah. So, to prevent this from getting too long, the last thing I want to say about gear is one of my top tips I tell everyone is, especially if you're going to go to Florida, there's a lot of Bass Pros, and if you're going to go Keys, but they're on East and West Coast. Bass Pro has these rods they call the Gold Cup rod. They're $60. They're excellent. And they have them in all different sizes. They go all the way up to, I think, 3 ounces. And they go all the way down to what would be a light freshwater rod. It's not even a light saltwater rod. I have bought one of those at the beginning of a trip, used it all trip, and left it in my room and just left. So you don't have to fly with a rod. Now, if you want a nice travel rod, that's fine. You're going to use it. That's fine. But if you're going to go for a week and you're I might get 3 days, to invest in a multi-$100 travel rod may not make sense. And it's another thing you have to bring. And if you've got kids and you're trying to bring a bunch of other crap, it takes up room. So go to Bass Pro, buy a Gold Cup. They're excellent. They work great. I have one here in the basement. I left some of my parents who recently retired to Florida. I use them down there. They have some better rods too, but use it, leave it. I've heard other people giving it to a kid. You walk along the beach, you see a kid. Here you go, kid. Here's a rod. Reels are super easy, so you can bring whatever. That's super easy, and then you can invest in something you can use here, you can use there, whatever. But the rod is tough to get. Fly rods, it's not really a problem, right? Because you can put them in, get a hard tube, and you put them in your check bag, no problem. So soft plastics, popper. Don't worry about the travel rod. If you don't want to buy one, go to Bass Pro, buy one of those rods. You can land tarpon on them. You can land 100-pound tarpon on them if you really wanted to. It wouldn't be a problem. Seriously. So let alone anything smaller, snook on down. So that's my big tip. I think that, focus, do what you know, soft plastics. Those are the keys. Oh, moving water. That's it. That's really the biggest things that made me successful across the board. This has been a weekly edition of the Surfcast Podcast. You can find out more about the podcast and find more episodes at surfcastpodcast.com. And be sure to check us out on social media at the Surfcast Podcast.